Hello everyone, this is AndresRestart, and this time we are talking about how the Nintendo Switch 2 first look trailer has actually revealed many intense graphical abilities of the console. And perhaps at first glance you saw the trailer, you saw the few brief seconds of Mario Kart 9 presumably, and didn't think much. There's even some people who think that this game might be possible on Switch 1, and I've talked about in the past how this is very unlikely. But upon closer inspection, when taking a look at this footage, there's actually a great deal of effects going on that showcase things about Switch 2 that simply are not possible on Switch 1. And YouTuber slash indie developer who has worked on Switch and other Nintendo platforms in the past, Sun Studios, put out a video a couple weeks ago, shortly after the reveal trailer, pointing out some of these elements. So my goal today is to take a closer look at some of these elements pointed out by Sun Studios. Their video will be linked in the description below, but I want to try and go in a little bit deeper here, further highlight why these elements are improvements over Switch 1 by a dramatic degree, try to explain what's going on in layman's terms, and also help to showcase a little bit more how these improvements could be apparent in other Nintendo games down the road. I will also mention that I am aiming to reach 50,000 subscribers by the time the Switch 2 launches, so if you do find yourself enjoying my content, I would appreciate it if you could subscribe and hit that notification bell. Before going forward, let me present you this message about CaveGamers. CaveGamers can be your source for high quality and authentic retro games. If you're looking to find an old piece of hardware or a game that you've always wanted or you're trying to build upon your collection, CaveGamers may be the ideal fit for you. It's authenticity that you can trust. Counterfeits are a big issue in retro gaming, but not at CaveGamers. They carefully inspect every item and receive guarantee that everything they sell is 100% authentic. Every item is cleaned, thoroughly tested, and ready to play. And there's a wide selection. Whether you're hunting for classic titles, rare gems, or retro consoles, CaveGamers has thousands of unique products to choose from. There is something for every gamer and collector. And there's also hassle-free returns. If for whatever reason something goes wrong, they've got you covered with a 90-day return policy. Your satisfaction is their priority, and you get free shipping for all orders over $25. So make sure to check out cavegamers.com, it will be linked in the description below, and if you're looking for a discount, well, you can use my discount code, Andres10. So something that is pointed out from the Mario Kart footage is that there appears to be a great deal of physical-based rendering. And essentially what this means is a more realistic simulation of how light interacts with the world. And so in the case of Mario Kart 9, as it's pointed out, you can see how the light looks more natural on Mario, for example. You can see the more warmer colors of the environment reflecting on Mario as well in a more natural way, something you wouldn't see in Mario Kart 8, for example. And this isn't to say that physical-based rendering hasn't been done on Switch, it has. Perhaps the best example of it is Metroid Prime Remastered. And what Retro Studios accomplished with Metroid Prime Remastered is a remaster that looks like maybe the best looking game on Nintendo Switch. But as we've discussed in the past, that was no easy achievement. And to use PBR on a larger scale isn't something really possible on Switch. Metroid Prime is not an open world game. In comparison to a lot of games in this day and era, the areas are quite small and narrow. And so to see PBR across this entire environment in Mario Kart 9, which we've talked about in the past may be an open world environment, I know there's been some pushback there, but when you take a look into the background, you see the different winding paths, you don't see how it connects to the beginning of the map, and when you take a look at the beginning of the map, the beginning of the track where the start line is, you see the characters on their carts passing through as if it's not the beginning of the race, meaning that this is at least lap 2. In other words, it's not a segmented track, but more likely a very large environment. And so it goes to show that the Switch 2 is going to be able to have physical-based rendering on a much larger scale than Switch 1. And to better highlight the advantages of physical-based rendering, take a look at this footage here. As you can see, once PBR is applied, these crafts look so much more realistic and better at the same time. Now imagine what this might mean for other games down the road. It doesn't just have to be realistic games, we already saw PBR and how it impacted Mario Kart albeit it's not direct feed gameplay and it's just a few seconds, so we can't get the best example, but it does give us an idea of how fantastic other Nintendo games can look as well. Something else that's observed with this Mario Kart footage is that there's a lot higher res textures. As we can see with the ground, there's definitely a lot more detail there compared to the ground textures in Mario Kart 8. And on Switch 1, typically cutting down on the textures on the ground can definitely make for a difference because that is resource intensive. And there are so many games I saw on Switch 1 that definitely didn't have the best looking textures and they were noticeable, so to see a significant improvement there is definitely going to be nice to see. But it goes beyond ground textures. When we take a closer look at Mario himself on the kart, we can see the texture of his pants, which when we take a look at the version of Mario in Mario Kart 8, it's very plain by comparison. And this is a very subtle detail that you would not really notice normally. But because of the vast improvements on Switch 2, attention to detail like this is going to be more commonplace. Another point made by Sungrand Studios is that there is a great deal of variety to the textures. And so seeing that variety in the environment certainly adds overall to the feel of it. It's something that's a lot more complex than what we saw in Mario Kart 8 for Switch or Wii U. And so when you start thinking about this variety to the textures, the high resolution, the attention to detail, in a much larger map, which by the way, also has not just 12 characters on karts at a time, but 24, it starts to become more apparent how much more demanding this game is compared to anything we saw on Switch 1 or Wii U. Which brings it to the point on geometry. Taking another look at this comparison between Mario in Mario Kart 9 versus 8, while yes, it's hard to see everything because we do not have full screen direct feed footage of Mario Kart 9, but even with that significant disadvantage there, you can still see that there is a tremendous difference in geometry in the karts. There's so much more sophistication to the karts in Mario Kart 9, but then even in Mario himself, take a look at his hands for example, and how much more depth there appears to be and how less blocky they look. And this level of sophistication applies to all the characters. And also here's a reminder of something else we've discussed in the past, all of the facial expressions in Mario Kart 9. They are far more elaborate, but also more natural and fun looking at the same time. And so with all this going on, it becomes even more impressive when you also consider that there's less apparent culling involved here. And what I mean is, as you look off into the distance, you still see shadows as part of the different objects, like the light posts for example. And pop-in is not as obvious either, where we see objects just appearing or disappearing off screen the further out you go. And then these shadows are clearly defined and detailed, and less simple like what we see on Switch 1. There is also apparently real-time cloth simulation. Taking a look at the flag posts as we see the flags waving about in a realistic way, this is not something you would see in Mario Kart 8. And so to see these kinds of effects applied in different Switch 2 games, I start to get a variety of different ideas. The physics involved here would certainly be impressive, and definitely not so feasible on Switch 1. Like for example, imagine a Xenoblade game where we see the hair moving around more naturally, or the clothes as well, and seeing them not cut into each other either. I've always found that a little jarring. One final point I'll get to here that actually has me really excited when I start to think about the implications is what's mentioned about volumetric lighting. And basically, volumetric lighting is the illumination of particles in the air, and this can have some different applications. For example, God rays, where we see light shining through the air, or even seeing how light bounces off the particles in the air for fog. So in the case of Mario Kart 9, as we can see a more realistic volumetric lighting, a fog off into the distance, that definitely adds more of a natural feel and flow compared to what we see in Mario Kart 8. And so this has me thinking about different Nintendo games that can better take advantage of volumetric lighting. I think back to the beta footage we saw for Twilight Princess, where we saw Link walking through a wood, and we could see some God rays, some light shining through the trees. But how might something like that look with modern technology, with volumetric lighting effects? And so I start to think about, how about a next generation Zelda game where Link is walking through a forest of some kind and we see the light shining through the trees, and there's actual God rays there. How beautiful is that going to be? I am eagerly anticipating the moment that happens. And since we are talking about how volumetric lighting might impact The Legend of Zelda in the future, How about with fog and mist, like what we saw in Breath of the Wild? Imagine that done to a much better degree. How might that appear? Could we even see that in a Breath of the Wild remaster, for example? That has been rumored. Or going back to the idea of seeing physical-based rendering on a larger scale, how might that appear? I start thinking about that tech demo we saw for Wii U, but that was a tech demo for Wii U back in 2011. This is 2025. What can be done with the Switch 2 with a modern Zelda game? Or any Nintendo game for that matter. Sure, the Switch 2 is going to have better third-party support, as we've seen reported several times already, but I start to think about what Nintendo can do with this significant hardware leap here. And so when taking a closer look at this footage from Mario Kart 9, there are a lot of things here that aren't possible on Switch 1, and that has me excited for what we might see on Switch 2. And of course, we should also take into account Nintendo's partnership with Nvidia. It's been widely reported that the Switch 2 will take advantage of some form of Nvidia's DLSS technology, deep learning super sampling. The most obvious example is some form of AI upscaling, where they can target a lower resolution in both handheld and docked mode, but with DLSS it will present as a much higher resolution, which will allow the Switch 2 to punch a bit higher than its weight. And yes, this will help games to look a lot sharper, which was a big issue on Switch 1, especially for some bigger third-party ports. But then we also take into account the reports from a little while back about the technical demonstrations for Switch 2, one being the Matrix Unreal 5 engine demo that showed off ray tracing effects on Switch 2. We know Nvidia's DLSS also uses ray reconstruction, so this simulation of real-world lighting effects on Switch 2 can also help to make an even bigger difference here. And then there's also the reported technical demonstration for Breath of the Wild running on a hypothetical Switch 2 spec range, where the game was apparently running at 4K, at 60 frames per second, and virtually no load times. When you take all of this into account alongside everything we discussed today, the experience on Switch 2 versus Switch 1 is going to be such a substantial improvement. And so that has me personally very excited. But what do you all think? Let me know in the comments below. This is AndresRestart. Thank you so much for listening and watching, and I'll see you all really soon. Take care. Bye.